I can remember when I moved to Los Angeles from New York. I'd lived in New York. I'd lived in the Bronx for 8 years, 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And I moved to Los Angeles, and on my way here to campus every morning, on my way to work, I always swung into the same gas station and got a cup of coffee. And the guy saw me every morning. And one morning I was running late, and I swung into the gas station and poured my coffee, and there was this line at the register, and the first person at the front of the line was arguing with the guy about the change, and there was like 4 or 5 more people in line, and I was running late. So I just, put my hand and said, "Hey, I'll catch you on the way back." It seemed like the obvious thing to do. And I leave, and I'm going towards my car, and like the attendant comes running out after me. No, no, no! You gotta pay! You gotta pay! You gotta pay! What? You see me every day. I told you I'd come back and pay it. I'd pay it tomorrow. That's what we do in New York. If you've lived in New York, you know how this is. People recognize your face at your local bodega. In New York, even if you were short on money, maybe you went in and you didn't have the $2. Actually, I mean, in New York, it's $1 to $1.50 for a cup of coffee. It's much cheaper. And you say, "Oh, all I have is a 20 today. Do you want to break it, or I'll get you tomorrow?" Just give me tomorrow, is what they'd say. That's New York. I'd like you to think about a city like New York. Maybe you've never been to New York, but you could also think of any big city: Chicago, Boston. Los Angeles isn't really a city. It's really just a giant, sprawling glob of weird neighborhoods. Um, think of New York. Now, there's two ways you can think about a city. Our author, Eknath Easwaran, he wants us to think in terms of the way he translates these words is gross and subtle. Gross and subtle. You might think of a city at the gross level, and here I'm thinking structural. The big skyscrapers, the buildings. In New York, the streets are all in these perfectly rectangular grids. No sharp curves, no real curves much at all, very few. Everything's at right angles. You might think of some of the noise, some of the sounds, the smells, the red bricks of the buildings. All this is the structural level of a city. But within that structure is something more subtle, the inner harmony of the city. And any city you go to will have its own subtlety. It'll have its own inner harmony. You see, I tried to import the subtlety, the inner harmony of New York into Los Angeles, and it didn't work. It didn't work. In New York, the citizens, the residents of that city, they have an inner harmony, their own kind of cultural code. What is that cultural code? Well, if they recognize you at the bodega and you're $1 short, you just say, "I'll get you on the way back." No problem. In New York, if you need to cross the street, what do? You look both ways. If there's no car coming, you cross the street. Again, I came to Los Angeles and I tried to do that right over here next to LMU at Bristol Farms, that little side street. I was crossing it, and somebody starts screaming out after me, "You can't cross the street with the little red man, the little walking man is a red light. You can't cross right now." I had no idea. In New York, that little red walking man, that's just a warning to look a little more closely. There's no rule saying you can't cross the street as long as there's no car coming. So you see, every city has its own subtlety, its own inner harmony. Today, we're going to do something that's happened in many places and times. Many philosophers, many thinkers, many religions do this. What we're going to do is we're going to consider the human being as a city. You and I are like microcosms of a city, according to the Katha Upanishad. And what does the Katha Upanishad tell us about this city? First, it tells us something about the gross city, the structural city. Our city has 11 gates. There is a city with 11 gates, says the Katha Upanishad. 2 of them are for exports only. 2 of your gates are for exports only. I'm sure you can guess which ones they are. One goes out that way, one goes out this way. One of the gates has since been closed. One of your gates was useful only before you were born. Shortly after you were born, the doctor cut the tunnel into that gate. It has since sealed itself shut and shall never be used again. I'm speaking, of course, of your navel. Now, then we have seven more gates, and these are pretty important gates. First, we have the side docks, these gates right here. We have 2 minor gates right there. We have 1 huge freight gate. And then we have 2 main gates, 2 very powerful main gates right here. I'll talk about the 11th gate in a moment. Let's for now focus on these 7 gates, because these are the 7 gates the Katha Upanishad wants to draw our attention to. Our life as we know it, depends on what happens at those gates. There are 2 kinds of goods that can come through those gates. Their names are Preya and Shreya. There are goods that can come through those gates which are only good because they're pleasant. They're just pleasurable. But also some goods come to these gates which, beyond being pleasant, might not even be pleasant, but are useful. What are they useful for? For the subtle life of the society within our city. Imagine if New York City suddenly imported several million people from Los Angeles. You know, there's been maybe a big earthquake happens here and people decide to flee Los Angeles, but they say we like living on the coast, so we'll go to New York. What's going to happen to the subtle life of New York? Maybe, hey, I'll get you on the way back. Maybe that stops being a thing. Because as people from Los Angeles filter into New York, the subtle life of New York will start to be replaced with that of Los Angeles. Same goes for Los Angeles. If a bunch of New Yorkers flee into Los Angeles, the subtle life of Los Angeles can change. There are things that are good, Shreya, useful, for building an inner harmony within yourself. And then there are those things which are merely pleasant. And if you let the merely pleasant, if you let too much of the merely pleasant into the gates of your city, it's going to dilute and pollute what's inside of you. This is the message of the Katha Upanishad. If you watch violent programming, if you watch pornography, if you look at disturbing images, if you listen to rough, violent, crude, vulgar music, if you eat a lot of unhealthy foods, these things will disturb the subtle harmony within yourself. It may disturb it so much, Yama teaches Nachiketa, it can become so disturbed and so unraveled that you don't even recognize that there's supposed to be a city in you anymore. Imagine like a post-apocalyptic movie in New York. You recognize the skyscrapers, the Statue of Liberty, the buildings, the streets, the red bricks. You've seen it in TVs, you know what I'm talking about. But there's no one around. There's a few people, but they don't talk to each other. You know, in New York, you've seen New York on movies. People hustle and bustle down the street. That's how they move in New York. Instead, they're just kind of languishing around. There's no honking. None of that subtle life of New York is there. You might not even recognize it as a city. It'll look like a decaying artifact from another time. Certainly not a sign of civilization. That's what happens if you let too much Preya garbage into your gates. Into these gates, this gate, these gates, or these gates. It contaminates what's within you. It contaminates the harmony that brings joy and peace and beauty to your life. And when you have the harmony of joy and peace and beauty, you can be helpful to those around you. You can help others develop their cities until many cities can flourish and become a confederation, a powerful nation. But if you let the intruders in, it disrupts everything. If you spend hours listening to people screaming at each other, it affects you. Children sometimes grow up in good households and sometimes bad. If a small child, from the time they're born, and these gates get opened up, if everything coming into these gates is people screaming how much they hate each other, people yelling at each other, people expressing anger, frustration, disappointment, what does that do to the inner harmony in a child? By the time that child is 10 or 12 years old, already the harmony might be gone. There might be just a little bit of foundation left that they have to rebuild their city out of. And this is why we live in such a dangerous time. 100 years ago, there were no billboards. 100 years ago, if somebody wanted to sell you something, they had to come to your door and try to sell it to you. And often it would be somebody you knew. It would be your neighbor, just that's how they may have made their living. Nowadays, nonstop, there are forces trying to break down your barriers, break down your gates to disrupt you. You know as well as I do that there's a political party in this country screaming, build the wall, keep them out, build the wall, keep them out. Who are they saying it about? Human beings. I wish instead of saying it about human beings, we said it about Preya, about those negative forces that seek to disrupt us. You see, your city has a monarch. It has a king or a queen. Who is the queen or the king of the city? You and your mind. You can determine what gets through the gates. You determine what to look at. 24/7, there's somebody selling Preya who wants to shove something bad through the gates. Advertisers. They will sell you sugar and fat and tobacco and drugs and alcohol, promiscuity, greed, avarice, anger. Turn on a news channel and you'll just see angry people, very angry people screaming at each other. Let me tell you something. When I lived some years ago, I lived and worked with my father, and we had 2 dogs, and they were very obnoxious dogs. And my dad and I would come home from work, and my dad would sit in the living room, and he would turn on one of these talking head news channels where, the people are getting loud and obnoxious and getting all worked up over whatever's going on in the news all the time. And the dogs were always barking and obnoxious. One week, my dad had to go out of town for a business meeting, so I had the house to myself, and I had to watch over the dogs. I do not watch talking, shouting heads on the news. I would come home, I might play classical music. Sometimes I would watch old movies on PBS. The dogs began calming down. You see, a dog also has gates, but the dog doesn't have a monarch. The dog doesn't have a king or a queen determining what gets in the gates the way you do. When you bring good things through your gates, good things happen within you. What's hanging on your walls? Good things? Bad things? Peaceful things? Good memories? I've got a poster of a concert I went to with some friends some years ago. It was a good time I had with friends. So my poster is a reminder of that. I've got other things. There, I've got a picture. There's a picture of the Sacred Heart. I can't get the camera all the way around, but I've got a statue. I've got a statue of the Buddha over there. When you put the good things through your gates, when you let the good things in, you create a culture of goodness. But the more you let in prayer, the more you let in sheer pleasure, well, it's like having a guard, an army of guards. What happens if your guards don't exercise enough? If they eat too much, drink too much, they get fat and lazy. And then they can't stop the enemies from coming in. Even the sense of smell. I have a very weak sense of smell, by the way. I've seen people with better senses of smell who cannot walk past a restaurant without getting a giant slice of pizza for themselves. I've seen people addicted to all kinds of. I've seen people addicted to television, to music, to sleep. All these things can happen depending on what we do with the gates to our cities. So a lesson from the Katha Upanishad, right, is that you should reflect on the connection between the gross structures of your city, and especially the gates, and the subtle life of the life of the city within you. Now, the 11th gate. Nobody's sure where the 11th gate is. Some yogi masters thought that the 11th gate was the fissure in the skull where the various skull bones meet. Because once you've mastered your city, you're able to peacefully leave the city. In Hinduism, there's a strong, robust notion of reincarnation that helps explain some of this. The notion is that the master of the city, if you've mastered your city, if you've taken good care of the gates to your city, then like any good king or queen, you know how to get out of your city into safety when you have to. When the time comes, they say, you'll be able to escape through a secret passageway because you've mastered your own city. You're master of your own city. But if you're not master of your own city, what happens? Then when it comes time for your body to decay, you're in the constant cycle. You're still in the constant cycle of suffering. You won't be able to evolve to the next stage of consciousness, according to this Hindu philosophy. So, if you want to practice this contemplative tradition, start taking care of your gates. Limit how much bad stuff comes through the main gates. Start putting good stuff in front of the gates. You can spend a few minutes more a day contemplating, looking at, just gazing at beautiful flowers, or a few more minutes a day staring at an image of your Lord. If you're a Christian, you might look at an image of Jesus. If you're a Buddhist, an image of Buddha. If you're a Hindu, you might spend more time in front of gazing at your deity. And listening, instead of listening to violence, anger, spend more time listening to Vivaldi. Spend more time listening to beautiful poems and religious music, religious chanting, hymns. You might listen to a sutra being recited or a psalm. And this gate, you want to be careful for what you bring in. If you bring in fried foods and lots of unnecessary meat, if you're eating meat 3 times a day for no good reason, that's a kind of violence that's coming into your mouth. And then this gate also, you can send forth to others what's useful and good. You can also tear others down, so be careful. Because all these things will affect the subtle city within you. Next, we need to learn how to train the monarch. I've said that it's you and your mind that's in charge of all these gates. But how do you strengthen the monarch? How do you strengthen your mind? Meditation helps, but the recitation of the mantra also helps. So in our next lecture, we shall discuss the mantra. Keep meditating.